Hey, how's it going? Welcome back to Maybe Actually Museums Are For Me. I'm Alex, and I am excited to kind of bookend our month of Inness. We started the month talking with Gail Stavitsky, our chief curator here at the Montclair Art Museum, talking about, the actual artistry and style and vision of George Inness as an artist through his work, through his paintings, that sort of thing. And it was a really insightful and interesting conversation that I was really thrilled to have with Gail, specifically about the work of George Inness. But that conversation kind of brought up a deeper and more maybe interesting question in some ways, because here in Montclair, we know who George Inness is. Like I said in that episode, his name is on buildings. Obviously, we have this gallery here at the Art Museum. And I think within Montclair, we have this conscious idea that he was an important figure. But I think for many, they don't understand who George Inness, the man, is. They may only know the art. And so that's what I'm so excited to dive into today. On the episode, we have Adrienne Baxter Bell. Now, who is Adrienne? Adrienne is a professor of art history at Marymount Manhattan College in New York. She received her doctorate with distinction in art history from Columbia University with a dissertation on George Inness's painting philosophy. She, alongside her work with George Inness, teaches seminars in all aspects of Western art history, as well as courses in American studies and women's studies. She is the author of George Inness and the Visionary Landscape, a book that accompanied an exhibition she curated for the National Academy of Design and San Diego Museum of Art, as well as the work George Inness, Writings and Reflections on Art and Philosophy. Adrienne has lectured and published essays on a diverse range of subjects in American cultural studies, including the role of gesture in 19th century American landscape painting, tonalism and ecology, the influence of the Hudson River School on contemporary artists, the pioneering American art critic Anne Hampton Brewster, and the American expat artists such as John Singer Sargent and Charles Carroll Coleman. And she recently completed the first critical study and catalog of Coleman's art. So all of that is to say, Adrienne Baxter Bell is one of the most, premier speakers on the topic of George Inness and a perfect candidate to sit down in conversation with me today. So without any further ado, here is Adrienne Baxter Bell on George Inness. Hi, Adrienne.
Hi, Alex. How are you?
Good. How are you? What's going on?
Good. We're looking forward to a big symposium on Saturday
to
celebrate the 200th birth of George Inness.
It's exciting. It's really exciting. And I'm so glad that we finally got to connect and talk about this. We did an episode a few weeks back now. I think it came out on the 30th of April, so right before George Inness's birthday. Mm-hmm. And it was an episode Gail and I did together where we talked at length about the artwork of Inness, his actual stylistic kind of what he brought from brush to canvas. Mm-hmm. And we did dabble in the history of Inness a little bit more, but it was very clear that, we should actually be consulting with an expert on the topic who's written books on it and whatnot. So
makes sense.
Here you are talking to me, and I'm so thankful that you're here.
My pleasure.
I want to start by asking maybe the most simple of questions on paper. I think some of these might come across rather simple, but I think for the community, a lot of people in Montclair know the name George Inness. Mm-hmm. They've seen his name on the public schools. They've been here to the museum and been through the galleries perhaps, but I think at times people can get lost with actually who Inness is, who he was, who is Inness the man. I guess in a deeper way, why should people care who George Inness is? Right. And I guess for the sake of the audience is basic understanding.
Sure.
Who is George Inness?
Who is George Inness? So can't say I met him, but I have spent quite a lot of time with him, so I have a bit of a sense of who he was as a person. And actually, we have quite a few things that he wrote and letters that he wrote. So when you put all that together with his paintings, an idea comes across of who he was as a person. I think mostly I base my sense of who he was on his paintings. So when we do that, we see that he was very kind of complicated guy. So he began his career, as did most of his colleagues. He was born in 1825. He began his career as a Hudson River School landscape painter. He learned from the leading artists of that time period, Thomas Cole, Asher B. Durand, not necessarily by seeing their paintings, but by looking at prints of their paintings, which were available. He also studied an Italian artist named Salvador Rosa, and that gave a lot of kind of energy and Baroque dynamism to his work. There's a painting in the Montclair Art Museum that's very influenced by Salvador Rosa. It's actually the first painting in the new exhibition. And then he went to France and he studied Barbizon school painting. The Barbizon artists were the leading French landscape painters of the 1830s and 40s, and he was transformed when he saw their work because it was very expressive and it was very dynamic, and they were using brushwork in a very exciting way, much freer, much more dynamic than his American colleagues. So his identity as a Hudson River School painter was actually quite short-lived. He's also known in many circles as a tonalist. So when you look him up on Wikipedia, that's his identity is one of the co-founders of a group of artists called the Tonalists. And the Tonalists were late 19th century artists who flourished. They flourished around the 1880s, 1890s, all the way actually into the early 20th century. And they explored the idea of using subtle tones of color to express mood. I tend not to affiliate Inness very much with the tonalists because they tend to be very decorative artists. So artists like Whistler are much more interested in the decorative qualities of paintings, not so much Inness. The thing that makes Inness really distinct from all of his colleagues is that he was a metaphysician. So what's a metaphysician?
I was going to say, please
what's
enlighten
a metaphysician?
Me. What
please
is that?
Describe. I'm not making this up. He was actually identified during his lifetime by many people as a metaphysician and as somebody who was preoccupied with metaphysical questions. So what does that mean? A metaphysician is a type of philosopher. So a philosopher asks questions like, who am I? What is the nature of the world I live in? A metaphysician is particularly interested in topics like, what's the relationship between the world I live in and the spiritual realm? Is there a relationship? What is the nature of space? Is space a definite quality that I can measure, or is it something that is non-measurable?
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah.
Is time a constant phenomenon, or does it change according to my perception of it? So those are questions that metaphysicians answer, or at least they grapple with them. And George Inness was really preoccupied by these questions. He studied philosophy, he studied metaphysical topics, and it is said that he wrote piles upon piles of manuscripts on these subjects. We have some of these texts, but not all of them. Most of them were destroyed in a house fire. But the extant texts that we have from Inness's hand do clearly show that these are the topics he was really interested in. He did not become a practicing philosopher. He wasn't a professor of philosophy. What he did was actually work out his ideas about metaphysics and these big philosophical topics through his paintings. So the main question for people who are engaged with Inness studies is, how did he do it? How did his interest in metaphysical ideas, how did his preoccupations with theology, for example, how did they relate to his work as a painter? He was actually asked once toward the end of his life, Mr. Inness, what do you do when you grow weary of painting? And he said, then I turn to theology. It's the only thing except art which interests me. In fact, he said, it is theology, meaning his paintings. That it is theology, but it has gradually resolved itself into a scientific form, and that's the development which has become so very interesting to me. So
I can see why. I can see why. That is so fascinating.
That's the big kind of juicy problem that he leaves for us, and that we as people who are fascinated by his paintings. That's what we're kind of gnawing at
And
for a long time.
absolutely, yeah, I can certainly see why.
Yeah.
I'm gonna deviate a little bit, but because there's a few that I wanted to ask, but I guess just on a personal note, just us talking.
Yeah.
How strange does it feel in a way, like, to feel so closely connected to somebody you've never met? And, like,
Good question.
I mean, like, because I do a lot of storytelling for this job. We were just talking about it off microphone, but I often have to kind of dive into the heads of the artists that I'm profiling. And I have the benefit of physically being in the studio with them.
Right.
I'm not, working off of, half collected texts that have been burned in a fire. Like, like I'm physically with the person. And I almost feel like I've kind of joked about this with some family members who ask what I do. And I kind of boil it down to, I feel like I'm an anthropologist of artists in a way.
Yes.
And that's certainly, I think, maybe a way that you could describe your work.
Yes, I think that's very true.
Is it strange feeling so connected to this singular person? Obviously, you've written other books and you have other areas of study, but just seeing the way that you talk about Inness is so profound. And I guess I just wonder, like, what causes you to jump so deep into one person's life?
Yeah. It's funny.
I know this isn't on the list of questions, but it's top of mind right now.
That's all right. I'm often asked these questions because as a historian, we do tend to get to be very close to people who've died. Yeah. We time travel many ways, and I'm a historian of art. So in my teaching career, I have to go all the way back, to the ancient Near Eastern artists. I go all the way, a bit farther back. I go back to the cave painters. Mm-hmm. So in a way, we're used to this idea of time travel. We're used to going back really far and trying to imagine what it was like standing in Lascaux Cave or Chauvet Cave and actually painting those bison on the walls. Or going back to ancient Greece. I have a particular interest, for example, in the women of ancient Greece. I teach a lot of teach about them in my courses, and so I have to kind of imagine myself being a woman meandering around Athens in 450 BCE, or an ancient Roman woman. I teach a lot in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, so I actually see images of these people carved in stone and get to know them and get to know their lives through things like inscriptions. So it's less weird for an historian. We're used to it. We think of ourselves as sort of hunter-gatherers, that we go out hunting for documents, hunting for information, and then that's our job, is to put it together in a way that's comprehensible, that is exciting and interesting for other people. It's not enough to gather the information. You have to know how to process it, and you have to then figure out how to make it exciting to other people. In my case, 18 to 22-year-old students. So
I was just there. I get it.
Yeah.
Wow. So one thing you said in that conversation about, like, standing in Athens and stuff and trying to kind of contextualize that for yourself and place yourself in those shoes, I think pivoting back to Inness, and this leads to a question that I had for you, but you're kind of almost doing that every day that you're you live in Montclair.
Yeah.
Like, you're here. And I imagine when you walk through somewhere like, I don't know, Mills Reservation, and you could see what is left of rather untouched, nature in Montclair. You have to see. I see Inness's work in those in those hiking trails. And you talked a little bit in the first question about Inness's travels, France, Italy. I know he was in England also.
Died in England.
Yeah,
Scotland.
And I suppose, what made Montclair so special to Inness? Why is it so important to his work? Why is so much of his work about this place? Obviously, it was towards the end of his life, and so on and so forth. But he's been all over the world. Why is Montclair so closely connected to him?
So there are actually two questions there, and one has to do with his work, and the other has to do with him personally. So he did travel. He was born in Newburgh, New York, and then his family moved pretty quickly down to Newark, New Jersey. Then he lived in New York City for a little while. He moved to Medfield, Massachusetts. His house is actually still standing in Medfield. I visited it. He had a short tenure in Perth Amboy, New Jersey.
Oh.
Yes. There was something called Eagleswood Military Academy, and he was a painting instructor there.
Very fascinating. Okay.
Fun fact, they built a house for him, and it stood until 1997, I believe. And I visited it shortly thereafter, but it had just been torn down. It was unfortunately not put on the historic property register, but it was there for many, many years, and now there's a gas station. So that's very unfortunate. But the house in Medfield still exists. Then, and as I said, he did travel to France, to Italy, died in Scotland. After the Italian sojourn, 1870-74, he moved to Boston, then came back to New York. I think he moved to Montclair, which was founded in 1868, for the reason that everybody moves to Montclair, which is that they want access to the city and they want to be able to open their door to their backyard and see a tree.
Fair enough.
And that's why we all move out here.
It's almost timeless.
It is timeless. It is a major theme of the kind of New York commuter identity. And I'm not surprised he moved here because the landscape is gorgeous. There's a sense of peacefulness. There's a sense of calm that you don't get in the city.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I think that's why he moved out here. He moved out to a property that he subsequently called the Pines, and it was on Grove Street and Columbus Avenue. You can visit it today. I've often biked past it. Unfortunately, his house there was destroyed in 1911. He had a big house and several other houses, one of which was his studio. And fortunately, we have pictures of these things. There's a painting in the Montclair Art Museum.
By his son, correct?
By his son,
yes.
Painting him outside of his studio with a very suspicious-looking cow watching him paint. It's a black and white painting, grisaille painting. But that's where he painted. Now, the question is, why was he so connected to Montclair? The funny thing about his paintings is that Montclair is in the title of a lot of paintings, but George Inness very rarely titled his paintings. He left that work to his family and to his art dealers.
That makes sense why there's a lot of sunrises and sunsets.
A lot of sunrises, a lot of sunsets,
Yep.
and a lot of Montclair in the title.
Yeah.
But you're not able most of the time to identify the place where he actually painted a particular site. With a lot of Hudson River School paintings, and this is another thing that really distinguishes him, you can say, Thomas Cole was standing in this area, or Bierstadt was standing here, or more likely, Frederick Church went down to Ecuador and made all of these various sketches and then came back to the studio and compiled the sketches into one unified worldview. With George Inness, you don't have that kind of clear connection to a particular place in Montclair. And I think it's a concept that aligns very much with his metaphysical philosophy. He said, you can never show me reality, you can only suggest to me reality. So in his paintings, he fundamentally was not interested in doing what so many of his Hudson River School colleagues did, which was to represent nature as we see it with our physical eyes. He was interested in representing something that was actually unseen to the physical eye. And that's where the metaphysics comes in. That's where the philosophy and the spirituality comes into it.
Yeah.
So
And
Montclair was important,
yeah.
but it was not a place where you can go and kind of map out where was he when he painted these scenes.
Totally. Yeah.
So
You can't do like a bar crawl of all of his
can't
his
quite do it.
landscapes.
There are a couple places,
Yeah.
Tony's Brook, but not
Yeah. And
not like other artists.
do you think that, I mean, obviously you noted some other artists who had done similar things, obviously with more of a tangible like sketching and bringing them back to the studio to then work on. But do you think it's that spiritual nature of the work of Inness and almost the imaginary that kind of that's evoked in it that makes him different from other landscape painters, or is it something more than that?
Well, it is a lot.
It's always something.
It's something
it's
more.
always something more, isn't
With
it?
George Inness, is always more.
Yeah.
I've been working on him for many, many years, working on his work for many years, and trust me, there's more to learn. So yes, there is this idea of the spiritual in his work. This idea is not unfamiliar to people who study the 19th century in general and 19th century landscape painting in general. Spiritualism was rampant in America during the 19th century. It was part of what we talk about as the Second Great Awakening, which was a new kind of connection to the spiritual realm that was more intimate, that was more fiery in a way than any kind of doctrinal or traditional religion that permeated American culture in the 18th century. In upstate New York, there was an area literally called the Burned Over District because there were so many new evangelical religions that were being founded at the time. Mormonism, the Shakers had been around, the Quakers had been around. So there were a lot of religious beliefs, and spiritualism with a big S as a religion was kind of ignited by a group of mystics, really, called the Fox Sisters. And they spread this notion that you could actually communicate with the dead. They believed that they could communicate with the dead. So a lot of people had Ouija boards, and a lot of women actually became mediums. And it was, in a way, it was a kind of progressive act because they got out of the house and they got paid for their work for the first time, but they couldn't actually speak in their own voice. They spoke in the voice of the spirits who communicated to them. So in the midst of all this and the founding of Transcendentalism in the 1830s.
I'm getting like flashbacks to all my DBQs from A-Push history
there you
in
go.
high school.
It's important to remember.
It's all coming
Ralph
back.
Waldo Emerson,
It's all coming back.
Thoreau, Walden Pond, they never go away. But they are really central to understanding why Inness was so driven by spiritual ideas. He was part of a whole generation of people who believed that you could have what Emerson called an original relation to the universe. You didn't have to go into a church. You didn't have to have a priest. You didn't have to have a minister. You could go into nature, right? Emerson literally wrote the book called Nature, published in 1836. And he said, standing on the bare ground, my head bathed in the blithe air, all mean egotism vanishes. Like my sense of who I am as a person vanishes. I become a vessel for the inflowing of spirit from God. I am part and parcel of God. And so this was a huge change for people. And into this kind of fertile terrain of spirituality came the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg. But he was essentially Swedish. He started his life, he was born in 1688. He started his life as a scientist, big career as a scientist. He was involved in mining and chemistry and all kinds of things like that in Sweden. And then at the age of 54, he started to have divine revelations. And he started to believe that angels were speaking to him and telling him to reinterpret the Bible. So this is a branch of biblical studies called biblical exegesis. And the idea is that you can re-examine the stories of the Bible in a new way. And Swedenborg did this. And he ended up writing something like 3 million words of biblical interpretation in Latin. So all of this was ultimately it was translated into English. It migrated to England, and then it migrated to America. And by the mid-1850s, none other than Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "This age is Swedenborg's." Everybody was reading Swedenborg. Everybody was reading about his sense that the spiritual world was actually deeply invested in nature, that when you walked around, you didn't just see a tree, you saw a tree that became a tree not just because of natural light, but because of what he called the influx of spirit from the divine. It's actually a very indigenous point of view. When you think about it in terms of the indigenous view of nature, there's a lot of similarities. But suffice it to say that Inness was very taken by Swedenborg's writings. He was probably introduced to them in the 1850s. He spent the 1850s reading, and in the late 1860s, he converted to Swedenborgianism. He was baptized in the Swedenborgian church. There's a painting in the Montclair Art Museum called Christmas Eve, that he painted in 1866, and it shows a real change in his painting style that I think is really influenced by his devotion to Swedenborgianism. So,
and is that when it becomes more hazy, more blurry?
That's when it
kind of
becomes
thing?
more hazy and blurry,
Yeah.
and that's where you start to see this sense that there's some force that you can't quite identify. It's not natural light, but it's some other force permeating the world around us that's changing the way we see it. It doesn't look like the nature that we see when we open the window and we look outside and we see a tree. There's a distinct difference between that physical perception of nature and the Swedenborgian perception. And this is where Inness is saying, you cannot show me reality, you must suggest to me reality.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Now, when this transition from more like, again, sorry, not on my list, but top of mind, when the painting started to get more hazy, more blurry, more abstract, if you will.
Yep.
Maybe not, but how old was Inness at this time? Because I always interpreted it, and maybe it was just the way that my brain kind of rationalized it, but the way that the gallery had been set up prior to the new reinstallation was that you kind of see his transition from very vivid, very clear, very
Delaware Water Gap, Hudson River
absolutely.
School, meticulous style
and then
painting.
It transitions into this more hazy, abstract, kind of luminous thing. And personally, and again, this is just my own interpretation of the room, but I always looked at it as the older that he got, the more honestly just his eyesight was going, and that's what he was painting. And I know that's obviously not accurate, but that's kind of how I looked at it. And I imagine that a lot of this happened with his age, though, or is that not necessarily the case?
It's funny you say that, because he actually said when he was quite a bit older, he said something like, I see things now that I never saw before. So he didn't interpret the word seeing or the concept of sight the way we do. Yeah. He saw it more like insight. And I think the transition that you're talking about, which was very explicit in the previous hang of the show, really did align very much with his investment in theology, in his investment in this metaphysical theology of Swedenborg. He used painting as a way to explore theological ideas. He wrote, we know he wrote, but he wasn't satisfied with writing. This is one of the things that makes him such an interesting human being. Put aside, the idea of being an interesting artist. He used art as this vehicle to explore ideas that he couldn't explore in words. And I think a lot of artists do this. They don't feel comfortable necessarily writing or talking about art, and they have issues that they want people to be aware of, or they have impulses, or they have just a creative urge. And so they use the vehicle of whatever, paint on canvas, watercolor, sculpture, whatever their medium is. And I think this is very much what he did. And you did see it more explicitly in the show, because the very beginning of that show had these quite meticulously painted compositions. The famous Delaware Water Gap of 1854, painted with, literally like a few brushes, a few hairs on a single brush. You have a terrain. This is the terrain between New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and it's mapped out very explicitly. You can see the striations of the farmland, But that's when he just began his connection to Swedenborg in the 50s. And it takes a while to allow these ideas to permeate your life and to then figure out how you're going to translate them through paint on canvas. And Christmas Eve is a painting that allows us to see that transition. There's actually an even clearer comparison. There's a painting that's just called Sunset, and it's a little painting. I put it in an exhibition that I curated of George Inness's work many years ago, and it's of the Delaware Water Gap. But you have none of that explicit terrain that you see in the 54 painting. The later painting is 1866. So in 12 years, he completely changed his approach to painting. And I think that is not only a product of reading Swedenborg's writing, but also seeing the Barbizon School. Barbizon School artists were much freer, much more expressive, as I said, in painting. Also, they believed in the spiritual identity of forms in nature. Theodore Rousseau, whom he greatly admired, was also an adherent to this belief. So all of these kind of rivulets of influence come together, and they charge into a stream that becomes a new approach to painting. And we saw that in the previous hang of the show. And then he goes to Italy in 1870, and he paints two different kinds of paintings, one more meticulous, but you have a painting down in the gallery called Old Aqueduct, Campagna, Rome, and it's painted in this far more expressive style. And then we get into the late landscape paintings. So that transition is not as clear in the current show, but it was in the previous one. Yeah. Although I love the current show.
Yeah.
Nothing against that.
So was today your first day of seeing it?
No, I saw it last week.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, Adrienne, we've covered so much, and we kind of in a roundabout way covered my question about what was happening in the state of America during Inness's life. So if you want to talk a little bit about that, we can certainly go, but I kind of just wanted to, I guess, cap this, if you will, with one final question.
Sure.
If someone wanted to understand George Inness through one painting, which we've kind of just went through a few of them, but which one would you suggest, and why? What is maybe it's a good introductory point. Maybe it's a good kind of window into his spiritual transition. But is there something for maybe the untrained viewer to really dive into and better know both Inness the man and Inness the artist?
Yes. Well, I think the two paintings I just mentioned, both at the Montclair Art Museum, would be a very good start. That the painting called Christmas Eve is really haunting. It's a painting that I see a lot of people going up to when they're in the galleries, and they're really fascinated by it. There's a figure in the foreground who looks like he's walking away from you, and you have to look really carefully to see if he's walking toward you or walking away from you. But he does represent a kind of pilgrim on a journey. And I think a lot of people are drawn to that painting because they feel that we're all on a kind of pilgrimage. Our life is a kind of pilgrimage, that we're making our own map and walking our own map. And so we see this individual person who is doing that as well in a kind of inhospitable terrain. And I think we've all felt that sense of sometimes we're not we're kind of in an inhospitable terrain. So they relate very much to that challenging solitary journey. There's the other painting that I'm really drawn to is called Old Aqueduct, Campagna, Rome. And I think he did it in the 1871. I think it's an 1871 painting. And there are some sheep in that painting that are extraordinary. So if you're in the area, come look at the sheep in that painting. It's a scene near the famous Roman aqueduct, which is still standing. There are two shepherds. One of them, I think, is sitting on the ground. The other is standing. But then there's these sheep. And the thing is that they're not represented as sheep at all. What he did was hold his palette in one hand and then kind of scoop up some beigey, yellowy paint and sort of swirl it on the canvas. Just swirls. They're just sort of swirly gestures of paint. And if you look closely, you see this. They're just swirls on the surface of the painting. But if you stand back, all of a sudden they become sheep. So what's going on? And this is not something that is unique to Inness by any means. This is a technique of brushwork. This is an approach to brushwork that many great artists practiced. If you look, for example, at Rembrandt, you go to the Frick and you see the great Rembrandt late self-portrait, and you look at his right arm, you will see gestures of highlight on that arm. Light is hitting that arm. And the way that Rembrandt painted those highlights is breathtaking. He did the same thing, just gestures, streaks of paint to capture that momentary glint of light on someone's body. It's not explicit by any means, but it's using paint in this utterly magical way with pure bravado to capture an illusion. The late works of Titian are like this also. The late paintings like the Pietà, the lamentation over the dead body of Christ with the Virgin Mary. And there's an image of Mary Magdalene, and she's flinging herself into space because she's so bereft. She is so horrified to see this deceased body in front of her of Jesus. And her hair, which was famously long and red, is melding with her body, and it looks almost like she is aflame, like her passion has been telegraphed by this gesture of red coming off of her body. And you don't notice this really until you really look closely at the painting. But this is what really great artists can do. When they reach a certain stage in their life and with 2 or 3 magical brushstrokes, they can convey this extraordinary illusion of something that your brain translates into an object that you're familiar with. And Inness did this. And, we are incredibly fortunate to have many examples of how he did this in the museum. I would also draw attention to the beautiful new sunset painting from 1888 that is on loan to us from Frank and Catherine Martucci, or Inness collectors. They gave the funding for the beautiful Inness Gallery. I think Frank decided to have the phrase "knowledge must bow to spirit," which is a quote from Inness, on the wall. And it's a perfect choice for it. But they loaned us this painting, and it is fantastic.
It is so special.
It's a really beautiful painting, and it's an archetypal late landscape painting. We use that phrase to describe works from around the late 1870s to Inness's death in 1894. And it's a perfect example of what Inness did at the height of his powers. It's a liminal time, that magical moment between daylight and darkness when time sort of stands still. I always love watching a sunset or a sunrise. It's kind of a moment out of time. You feel it's kind of pregnant with possibilities. It's the time of mystical revelation. William James wrote about this in the Varieties of Religious Experience. So it brings us into this realm of ineffable possibility. And it's lovely to sit there and stay there and just imagine what dreams we can come up with by putting ourselves in these places. And this is what Inness does. He invites us into these realms. And I think it's a wonderful thing that an artist can do this. It can take us out of our daily lives and the kind of quotidian problems that we're facing and frustrations, and allow us to use our imagination and allow us to think about possibilities that we might not otherwise explore. So I would recommend that people come to the museum and look at all of the paintings on view. But I would say those are three of my favorites. I have other favorites, but those are in that gallery. Those are my favorite paintings.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, Adrienne, thank you so much, sincerely, for coming on the podcast and talking with me through this and providing the audience with a better insight of who Inness the man was.
Inness the artist.
Inness the artist.
The philosopher.
And the philosopher.
Yeah.
This has been such a joy, and it's making me severely miss my college lectures. So thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Okay. It was a lot of fun. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Adrienne, for sitting down with me for this lengthy episode. I honestly was so enamored by our conversation and, the topics we talked about. It made me miss college dearly. I love professors who could just go off on tangents and reel it back in a way that is conscious and makes sense contextually. And thank you again for being a part of it. I really do appreciate it. The Montclair Art Museum is open to the public Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, so, this weekend, why not come by the museum and see the George Inness Gallery? We have 3 new works on view, which we talked about in this episode, alongside all of our other regular programming and exhibitions around. There's a lot of cool stuff to see at the museum this month. So, yeah. With that said, thank you for listening to Maybe Actually Museums Are For Me. If you're interested in tuning in week to week, we have episodes every Wednesday at 10 a.m. You can find them wherever you stream podcasts. Thanks so much.